McFarland's Fuzzy Door Production Company. With McFarland and President Erica Huggins, Hargreaves-Heald shepherds project development and production and produces an expansive film and television slate, including projects under Fuzzy Door's multi-year television deal with Universal Studio Group. She's been with the company for almost 8 years, during which time its production slate has grown to include science documentaries like Cosmos, Possible Worlds, and science fiction like The Orville. Most recently, Hargreaves-Heald was the executive in charge of production on The End Is Nigh. Hargreaves-Heald graduated from the Mind, Brain, and Education program in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she carries her passions for education, science, and entertainment into her development work. She is helping to make the decisions that keep a place for science and entertainment. Welcome, Rachel. Brannon is a television showrunner, director, and screenwriter best known for his work on the Star Trek franchise, where he wrote or co-wrote over 100 scripts, playing with the possibilities of time through temporal causality loops, anti-time eruptions, and more. Brannon worked on The Next Generation and Voyager and the feature films Star Trek Generations and Star Trek First Contact, which I saw many times in the theater, then created Enterprise. Most recently, he has shared his fantastic vision with Fuzzy Door on projects like The Orville and Cosmos, bridging the gap between science fiction and science fact. He wrote and directed the science disaster series, The End Is Nigh. Prior to that, Brannon wrote and directed 2 seasons of Cosmos, the celebrated astronomy series. To those series, he brings a legendary reputation for helping us to see the universe in new ways. Welcome, Brannon. So I thought we could start. It's weird me being in the middle, having to look at both of you on both sides. But I thought we could start by just talking about how the making of this series. Maybe you could talk about how you first got involved with The End Is Nigh and where the idea came from.
The on switch. The idea for The End Is Nigh came, I got a phone call from Seth MacFarlane one night during the pandemic, and he was musing how effective fear was in getting people's attention, and particularly certain news programs are very good at fear mongering. And he was wondering how could we use that phenomenon for good? And we kind of came up with this idea of doing an end of the world show where the first half was some kind of worst case scenario disaster, and the second half would be more optimistic, how science might get us out of the situation. Or in this case, how it actually did at one time get us out of the situation. And Bill Nye came to mind, who we were friends with, and that's how it came to be. And we just kind of went from there.
Do you want to talk about how you helped this idea through the development process?
Sure. So I came onto the project once there was creative material to take a look at. My job is half creative, half kind of problem solver. So on the creative side, it's giving notes on outlines and scripts. It's weighing in on casting and wardrobe and set deck. And then in terms of kind of the problem solving communication side, I covered this project for Fuzzy Door. So it was kind of keeping everyone at Fuzzy Door in the loop. I was the go-between between the production and the studio and the network. So making sure everybody knows what's going on. And then kind of problem solving as stuff came up with the intent of protecting Brannon so that he could focus on his creative vision and I could try to deal with everything else.
Was there anything particularly unique about this idea when it came to you that made you think like, yes, we definitely need to support this one?
I mean, I think I'm a huge advocate of science, and anytime you can marry science with the idea of like a disaster movie is really exciting. I think that people sometimes think of science and entertainment as 2 distinct things, but they're really the same thing. And these are all topics that people should be aware of because all of them are happening now or could happen. It's really terrifying. There are a lot of things I didn't know about that I should be scared about. But it's kind of the Fuzzy Door legacy of using entertainment first to kind of bring an audience in, and then once they're there, kind of demystifying science. So, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of that. It's what Fuzzy Door does. And yeah, we love this project.
Thank you. What's it like working with a cult figure like Bill Nye? What could you describe his involvement in the project?
Well, for better or worse, he's exactly as he is on screen, which is to say, a lot of energy and focus and fun. He's the real deal, and he had a lot to. We wrote that episode together. We worked together very closely on this series, and I think it was the challenge of this show was to kind of show a slightly new Bill Nye. This isn't a kids show per se, so I kind of thought of him, put a little Rod Serling into Bill, that he's kind of a storyteller with something serious to say, but keep his trademark humor in there as well. But we didn't want to just do the same old thing with Bill. We wanted it to be a little different.
Was Bill an essential part of the pitch here, and what would make this work and make this something you could sell?
Absolutely. I mean, Bill is one of the most important science communicators of our time. And not only does he come in with an audience, which is really important in terms of selling, a buyer feels more comfortable saying yes to something when they know that there's either an idea or an attachment that is going to bring an audience in. But I would say more than that, Bill has a sterling reputation for a reason. And in making science content, you always want to make sure that it's above reproach, because there's so much suspicion of science right now, which I can't believe I'm saying. But you need to kind of signal to the audience that while this is going to be fun and entertaining, that we're going to tell you the truth about what's going on, because you don't want to break that trust with the audience by watering it down or kind of bending the truth to appeal to a new audience. Because when you break that trust, you lose your audience, and then you also negatively impact the other projects that are trying to tell science stories.
So maybe we could talk more about that idea of science entertainment and why it's important for science to be a part of our entertainment as opposed to just being something we would learn about in textbooks and things like that.
Well, my initiation into science, the presentation of science in a narrative form, I would say, was Cosmos. When I saw it in 1980, the original Carl Sagan version, and it really changed my life. I was in high school and made me understand what the scientific method was and introduced the concept of critical thinking. And I was lucky enough 30 years later to remake the show or do a second season and a third season of the show. And I really learned that science is not people in lab coats at chalkboards. You still have chalkboards in some of your buildings here. It's not equations and abstractions. It's real flesh and blood stuff. And what Cosmos did so beautifully was put it into narrative storytelling form. We're a storytelling species. And it was really, it's really effective. And when you tell a good story, the science will stay with you. And I really applied some of those sensibilities, probably not as well, in this show. And I was nervous about showing this episode because this school is an agricultural school, and I'm worried there were errors in this, but you can tell me that.
Well, do you want to talk more about the themes of this episode and agriculture and why you thought that was a particularly important idea for us to grapple with through entertainment?
Well, I mean, needless to say, we wouldn't be here not if it weren't for the invention of agriculture. What intrigued me about this episode for this show was it was the first instance of human-caused ecological disaster on a massive scale. There's much more to the story. No one believed it for a very long time, as you probably know. And there were analogs to climate change that are pretty obvious. And once people realized humans were causing the Dust Bowl, efforts were made to solve the problem using science. Like, and had they not, I don't think Wisconsin's farm fields would be here. I don't think any of it would be here. And so it was a disaster story that actually happened, and it has a somewhat happy ending. Some farmlands never recovered, but that intrigued me, because I don't think when people think of the Dust Bowl, generally think of these giant storms that really were like the end of the world. They were disaster movies every day for the people living out there. They think of they do think of, I thought of Great Grapes of Wrath. You know, it really wasn't until I saw Ken Burns' documentary about the Dust Bowl, which is amazing if you haven't seen it. It really knocked me out. I didn't know anything about this chapter of our history. So that's why I wanted to do this.
So it's an important story, but it also has to be an entertaining one. So Rachel, I maybe thought I'd ask you, what do you look for in pitches involving science that are also supposed to be entertaining, right? Like, are there compelling ways to do this that you've identified? Are there dangers people need to watch out for?
I think for all of Fuzzy Door projects, we look for a why now and something to say. So when I hear science pitches, I often think of, okay, what's the why now? What's going to draw people in? How is this affecting their lives? But to kind of go back to what I was talking about, Bill, you really need somebody attached to the project that is going to signal that the audience can trust the science in the story. I would say that's the most important part. There are showrunners like Brannon who blend so beautifully entertainment and science. So I'm kind of less worried about that and just more worried about how sound is the science and why are we telling this story right now.
Great. So Brandon, I have to ask you, based on your experience with Star Trek, are there ways in which your experiences with science fiction and your efforts to tell stories of science fact inform one another?
I wish I could say yes more strongly, but in the science shows, you can't make anything up. So there are no easy, in science fiction, it's whatever you can think of to get out of a situation, to end a narrative. Of course, many years on Star Trek and dealing with science fiction did prepare me for science, but writing for science television, it's just a different thing.
But when you write a science fiction show like The Orville now, do you bring anything from what you've learned about science now, science fact, back to that science fiction process?
There was a period where I was writing The Orville or writing Cosmos in the morning, and I would go around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, would go write on the Orville. There was no overlap at all. I wish I could say I wish I could say there was. One you make stuff up, one you don't.
It also sounds like you're able to structure your day very
Yeah,
effectively.
yeah.
So maybe lastly, we could talk about how you think science entertainment will evolve in the future. What kind of scientific discoveries or innovations are you paying close attention to as you're trying to produce this kind of programming?
How will science entertainment evolve? I just hope it evolves at all. I mean, I hope that people keep making it. It's kind of a subgenre at this point. I don't know what else is out there. I mean, what we do together at Fuzzy Door, and when Seth and I talk about these kind of shows, we like to. These are big budget shows. This is big screen kind of entertainment to really get people to watch, and we intend to continue to do that. I just hope other people do as well.
I would say one thing we've been talking about in terms of like the advent of technology is VR. I think that you understand science more when you're in the middle of it, which is kind of what we tried to do in this show. But through VR, you can take it to a whole nother level. So that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on, and how we can integrate that into our science shows going forward.
That sounds really cool.
How about a science filmmaking curriculum?
Dean Wilcox? We'll get a proposal on your desk. So maybe the last question I'll ask you then is, the end is nigh, right? Even the title is kind of pessimistic. And you sort of, Brandon, mentioned that this is a new Bill Nye, right? Like a sort of a darker version of him. But, there is still sort of this idea by the end of this episode and each episode, right? That these are problems that can be solved through science. So I guess I just want to ask each of you, as you think about the future, do you look at it hopefully or pessimistically?
Well, everything I've worked on, fortunately, has been very, including Star Trek, has been an optimistic vision of the future. I mean, absolutely.
I agree. Optimistic. I mean, this episode is one I love because it shows the power of science and how we can change things through science. And I think that will continue to happen in the future.
I mean, and then of course, the first thing is you got to acknowledge there's a problem. You know, that's the big giant, that's the first huge hurdle.
That's the first step. Yeah. So no one's here to hear my questions. So I'm sure many of you have things you'd like to ask our special guests. So at this point, I'd like to open up the Q&A to any questions you all have in the audience. And I see a hand there in back. We've got mic runners who will bring the microphone over to you.
I just have to ask this, Brannon, since we're within 2 hours of Dubuque, Iowa. What was it working with Kate Mulgrew? And do you have any bloopers or any interesting stories about it? Because Star Trek Voyager was my favorite show during college. So
thanks. I'm very fond of Star Trek Voyager as well. It was my favorite one to work on. Kate, you know, I don't really, you know, Kate Mulgrew was a force of nature. I mean, she was, you know, again, what you see on TV was kind of the way it was in real life. She was a very commanding presence and was really like a captain in real life. You know, she was a maternal presence, a leader, a lot of things. I loved Kate. Kate Mulgrew played the Captain Janeway on Star Trek Voyager, for those who don't know.
Unfortunately for me, I have experience on the cutting edge of cybercrime, and I would love to see it portrayed on the screen. And I wonder, part of my problem is I'm held cyber captive and I cannot reliably reach anyone or be reached by anyone except in person. So if people would want to talk to me in person, I am here.
Cool. Well, Dean's got a question.
Yeah, you kind of answered this already, but was the genesis of this episode seeing Ken Burns special? I was going to ask the general question for the 6 episodes of the show. Why did you pick those 6 disasters out of maybe there's another set of disasters?
Well, we had about a dozen options, and we picked, you know, we picked the ones we thought would be the most visual and the most poignant, and ones that hadn't been seen a million times already. I think the most familiar one we had was a comet, or in our case, a string of comets. But there was one we didn't do because people were just a little nervous about. The one episode I wish we'd done, because this is a show about natural and unnatural disasters. And this is an unnatural disaster. This was human caused. It didn't have to happen. The episode I wanted to do was authoritarianism as a global disaster, which it is and has been, and resulted in a lot of death and destruction. And it was an episode where this depiction of kind of a fictionalized authoritarian government taking over the country, and science is not appreciated. Bill was put in front of firing squad at the end of the first part. He dies in every episode, just so you know. And then the second part of the episode was going to be a meditation on critical thinking and how, if we can equip a younger generation with certain thinking skills, that it could prevent the crap that authoritarians put, the lies and fallacies that they use can be seen through with a little X-ray vision. But it was considered to be a little political, and people were scared of it. But that's the one I wish we'd done. Yeah, it is. There's inevitably a political component to all of it. You're absolutely right. Sorry, I had to share that idea. I hope I don't get in trouble with the network on it.
This is kind of related to the last question. I'm just wondering if you could tell us what future episodes, will be, what issues or themes they'll be addressing.
Well, we need to get a second season picked up by the network before that happens. I would hope authoritarianism would be one. What were some of the others we talked about?
Pandemic was one.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think that one we
pandemic was-
took on. People had experienced
Well, no,
it.
when we
they knew
made
that
it's not
disaster.
over yet, unfortunately. That we need an ending for that one. What else? What else? We had some good ones.
Those are the only two I can remember.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember at the moment. But we had some good ones.
So I was wondering if you could share anything about the process of like exploring for information on your science fiction writing process. Like, do you have any insight or stories about finding things such as, like, I think of Black Mirror and how some of the dystopian futures can come into reality. Like, do you have just like any of your thoughts would be appreciated on that process?
Well, I don't know if this answers your question or not, but I'll give you an example of something. When I was working on Star Trek: The Next Generation and Voyager, we would have certain plot necessities. We need characters to get information non-verbally. So we would have these things we called pads that they would hand each other, and they'd look at the information. And of course, in real life, they were just pieces of plastic with stickers on them. iPads would come to be a real thing many, many years later. And so we didn't know that. We didn't envision it. We didn't invent it. But what it began as a way of telling a story more efficiently. And but some things do come true, become reality after a while. I don't think I answered this question. Ideas come from all over the place, I don't know where they come from. For me, I do a lot of reading about science, and maybe I'll see something in a quantum physics article that I think, oh, I did an episode on Next Gen. I think I did one of the first multiverse stories. Now they're very common, but back in the 90s, they were more difficult to grasp. So, and I was like, well, this would be a cool episode.
So you, just a little bit ago, you talked about the difference with science fiction and science needing to be very accurate, not make up anything. So I'm curious, when you're doing like writing the part about the simulation, what part of that, like, I guess, where does science like come into the script? Are you writing that just based off? Do you like start with an idea and then consult and get interviews, or is there someone working along with that?
Well, we're imagining a scenario where dust storms would happen again. And so, though that's imaginary, we wanted it to be as plausible as possible. So in the case of this episode, we had two science consultants, one of whom lived through the Dust Bowl and has written many books about it and runs the Land Institute in Kansas, and a younger scientist to make sure everything was accurate. And every episode has a different specialist involved to make sure that we're not screwing it up.
And we also had a science consultant who came on from the beginning and stayed on all the way through post-production and was giving feedback on like VFX shots, or, we have a super volcano episode and he was weighing in on the color of the ash. if you were like not the nicest person on the planet, you would kind of hate him because he has an answer to every single question you ask him. But yeah, we went kind of above and beyond to make sure that everything in the episode, again, was like scientifically sound.
Yes, thank you. I was really excited to hear that you were talking about like VR and how those aspects might help communicate some of these ideas. I work in VR and education stuff, and so I think about some of these problems as well. And one of the things that when you brought up like the power of fear and like how to tell some of these narratives, especially like this idea of like kind of like a call to action kind of thing. Um, yeah, and I guess relating to that question, how do you kind of tread that line between like we're trying to like inspire or help people understand this thing, but like the idea of like if I do this thing, I'll reduce my carbon footprint by 10% versus like building some sort of idea or story that they can latch onto. Like how do you kind of balance that like that call to action and like the scientific soundness of what you're doing?
I mean, this was never a show designed to say recycle. Um, the disasters that are presented here are much faster than not that those things necessarily are hurt, but the call to action in these episodes is more along the lines of elect the right people, see what the problems are, um, educate tell your parents that you don't want to inherit a shitty planet, hold them accountable. They're bigger kind of solutions, if that makes any sense. Yeah, it's not really, I don't think, and it's funny because sometimes the network would say, can you give us a list of things
Yeah.
people can do at the end of the episode? And it's like, well, really nothing individually. There are bigger ways to do it. And though it's not stated in this episode, I think at the end of the first episode, he talks about, electing the right representatives who care about these issues, as an example.
And I think a lot of it was just making people aware that these issues exist. So then in the future, when it comes to election or it comes to voting one way or the other, they have this in mind because, again, they're aware of it.
There was one back here.
Hi again. So I'm curious, like, just between the initial idea, you're talking about like a from original phone call of how can fear be used to this final product. Was there anything in like the idea or the pitch that um that like felt like it didn't fit the ending or the end result that like was removed or anything that was like added on significantly?
In the initial pitch, there were no other characters. It was just Bill. And we eventually added little narratives with those other people you saw in the cafe because I think we realized there is such a thing as too much Bill Nye. And the other episodes have even, I think, stronger storylines with other characters. That was added in terms of, but there was nothing I don't think we came up with that we took away.
And I think also the addition of the characters, which was Brandon's idea, was meant to personalize these big disasters that we're seeing and hopefully help the audience emotionally connect to them, which again kind of will hook them into the show. So for an audience that might not normally watch a science show, we've kind of got them by the time we get to the hard science section.
This episode was the only one where they were all in one place, in this case, a cafe huddled together. And the other ones, they're separate characters doing separate things with their own storylines dealing with the disasters.
Hi, I have a question about the science, as it turns out. So one of the things that I was thinking about was as Bill sort of talks through some of the things that can be done as kind of a solution, one of the things that comes up is drought-resistant crops. And the first thing that I wondered to myself was kind of like, are we talking genetically modified organisms? And sort of a broader question on top of that is kind of like when we start talking about things that are solutions, we get a lot less detail, obviously, about some of the things we can do versus all the things that were done wrong in the past. And I'm just wondering how much of that is just an issue of, to get buy-in, sometimes it's easier to think about a kind of abstracted goal rather than the hard questions of all the things you need to do to get to that, which may not, be the kinds of things that everybody's going to readily agree to. And how that, as kind of science and entertainment, how that kind of factors into some of the ways you present the information.
I mean, it's a really great question, and it's an issue of time. These episodes are 43 minutes, and some decisions had to be made about what story to tell. And I agree with you at the end. When Bill's walking through the cornfield, he's saying, "Oh, but do this, do that, do this." It's very a little flippant. We made the decision to focus on the story of the Dust Bowl and what happened, and get into more detail about that. And in terms of things we can do today, I wanted to focus a little more on water reservoirs and that issue. All those other things that he lists, I made a conscious choice to not get into, because it was just getting in the weeds and it wasn't really the core of what I was trying to do. And I just didn't have time to get into all that. I wish I had. And there was even a version, I think, of the script where I got into more detail there at the end, but just going on and on. And at some point, you have to acknowledge that there are things that can be done. And to learn more, go on your computer. I mean, it's just a time thing. If it was a 2-hour episode, I probably would have gotten into that stuff more. But you're right in pointing out it's a little tossed off at the end.
Well, it also varies episode to episode. Like I think in episode of one, that comes to mind is one where we really get into specifics that people can do to change. That one's 5 hurricanes hitting the earth at once. And there are a couple other episodes where we talk about kind of like big solutions, which is kind of more on like the political policy level, and then small solutions, which is more on the individual level. So I think this one was such a big story that, to Brandon's point, we only had time for so much, but other episodes get at what you're talking about.
So Rachel, you talked about kind of the suspicion around science. What reaction were you expecting from people when this show came out, and what's the reaction been in reality?
I think it's about what we expected. If you go onto our IMDb page, there are people giving it like 0 stars just because it's Bill and they're never going to watch it. And then there are people who are kind of in that middle, who we got in the door because of the disaster series and they stayed because of the science. So I think it's pretty much what we expected it was going to be. There was an audience we were never going to get, and then there was a huge audience that we got because of the way that the story was told.
Yeah, mostly positive. I mean, overwhelmingly positive. But there are some people who don't like Bill because of what he represents, which is science. And a lot of people who say, he's not a scientist, what's he doing up there? Well, he's a science educator. Most science teachers aren't actual scientists necessarily. Some efforts to discredit Bill and in turn the show, which is baffling to me. I still don't understand it.
So I just want to say that I find like educational entertainment just super fascinating. And so for a series like this, which is science communication, I'm curious, like who you kind of went over this, but like who is your intended audience? I mean, more so in terms of like age. Like who is the minimum? I don't know what I'm trying to say. Minimum age that you like want to be able to comprehend this, and how does that affect the level of detail that you guys go into?
All ages. I mean, we were hoping this would be shown in classrooms. We were hoping it would get the attention of adults. This is a story I would be interested in if I came across it. Really, we were hoping for, a show that appealed to everybody. And it's a little intense for younger children, maybe, but, oh, okay, sorry about that.
But you mentioned a moment ago, Rachel, like you weren't trying to reach. There were some people you knew you wouldn't be able to reach, right? episode, does that complicate the idea that you're trying to reach everybody a little bit?
No, I think you still try to reach the widest possible audience, and maybe people are going to surprise you, but I think you're realistic about it. And the people who, as Brandon was saying, are suspicious of Bill or don't think that he's a scientist, I mean, you hope that they're going to turn on the show and you'll change their mind, but you have to be realistic about it too.
Other questions out there?
This is less of a science-based one, but of all the different depictions of death, what made you go with the one that you went with?
Well, the most fun part of the show for me was finding ways to kill Bill in each episode. He drowns in one. In the hurricane episode, he's blown away and he drowns. And
In
then,
two, he gets
super volcano.
Yeah.
He gets vaporized by a pyroclastic death cloud. In this one was probably the most challenging one. Watching him choke to death on dust was a little gruesome and not cinematically satisfying. So it seemed like a good old-fashioned cave-in was probably a good idea. The dust weighs something, enough dust. So I thought it was pretty effective.
Do you have a favorite Bill death?
I'm trying to think. I mean, Bill was up for anything. In like episode 1, he had 2 giant fans on him because in the hurricane, as Brandon said, he gets blown away. And then we were like dousing him with water. And he was saying his lines and having a great time. He's just like, he's up for anything. I don't know if I think I like them all equally.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, more on the deaf thing. I was wondering, is there like any meaning behind the Grim Reaper's name? It was James Francis Reaper or something like that. Is there any meaning?
That I apologize about that. This was a joke that I was pushing. I don't know why I thought that was funny, that he would have a middle name that was Francis. But and there was some pushback from the network saying, "What is this death thing? This Grim Reaper thing? This isn't funny." But they let it happen. It was just a little bit of absurdism. We like the Reaper image and I don't know if it was funny or not. Maybe this needed a laugh track or something.
Well, if you'll excuse the dust pun, there's a very dry sense of humor.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, where does that come from? Is that part of the original formula?
Yeah,
of the show.
The sense of humor, I think, given the disaster context, needed to be a little wry and somewhat morbid. The sky kind of had an agricultural symbolism to it, and it just seemed like it would be funny and we found a great guy to play Death. He was kind of like the Seventh Seal type guy, but he was funny somehow. And Death eating a hot dog is funny to me.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here with us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The End is Nigh and our conversation with Brannon and Rachel. And I just want to thank you both for traveling all this way to be here with us.
Thanks
We
for
really
everybody who
appreciate
came
it.
tonight. Thank you.
And I just want to remind everyone that the Wisconsin Science Festival continues throughout the rest of the week. And I encourage you to explore www.wisconsinsciencefest.org for more events happening here in Madison and all throughout the state. And I just realized it's WISCI Fest. No, don't spell it out. WISCIFest.org for more events throughout the week. So thank you very much for being here. Good night, everyone.